worth asking the question, why did the rest of the country not rise up when the Easter Rising broke out? Now, to answer that question, though, you kind of have to ask the question of, well, what was the Rising supposed to achieve? What was the purpose of it? There has been a tendency in recent decades to focus on, well, the notion of the Rising as a blood sacrifice, a kind of spiritual and metaphysical struggle in which, physical defeat was ultimately irrelevant. Now, that's a kind of convenient way of looking at it because it rationalises the fact that the Rising was defeated on the streets of Dublin. In terms of what happened around the country, well, you would have had fighting in Ashbourne, fighting in East Galway, and Escortia was seized. You would have had mobilisations of volunteers in Belfast and also Cork, and that was about it. So it's worth asking the question, was there a plan for the Easter Rising? Fragments of a plan can be discerned, and certainly some people involved in the Easter Rising attempted to make sense of what they had been involved in after the fact. Liam O'Brien, for example, who later went on to be Professor of Romance Languages at University College Dublin, came to the conclusion that there was a plan for a nationwide rebellion, with a focus on a rebellion in Dublin for propaganda purposes, and a rebellion with a more military element, that would take place in the western coast in general, and most especially in Kerry. Now, if you look at the rebellion in Dublin and ask the question, why was it defeated? Well, it's a simple question. The overwhelming application of military force in the middle of the First World War by the British authorities. If you look at the attempts to mobilise around the country, well, you have to ask a couple of questions. We've all heard of Eoin MacNeill's countermanding order that caused the Rising to be delayed by one day and to break out without the numbers that would have been involved. If MacNeill's countermanding order hadn't been issued, how many members of the Irish Volunteers and the Citizen Army and other organisations would have turned up on the 23rd of April 1916? You're not talking about huge numbers because, bear in mind, this Republican uprising broke out in a Redmondite Ireland. If you factor in the numbers that are assumed to have taken part in the Rising in Dublin and add in those who would have mobilised around the country, you might have 3,500. These are small numbers. Now, even if those people did turn up, what were they supposed to do? And what were they supposed to do it with? A crucial strand in the prelude to the Rising were attempts to get military assistance from Germany. Now, that took the form of a relatively small number of weapons that ultimately never landed. Now, bear in mind that the volunteers were starved of weapons. You had men in Galway and Dublin going around with shotguns, not kind of the military technology you associate with the First World War. In Enniscorthy, volunteers were sufficiently desperate to try and start making pipes. And there is a photograph of the aftermath of the Rising in Dublin showing a British soldier carrying an armful of pikes. That gives you an illustration of just how desperate the volunteers and other organisations were for weapons. So even if they had turned up, what would they fight with? And then, even if they had weapons, what were they supposed to do? The plans that were issued, or the instructions that were issued around the country, seem to have been quite vague. I mean, you did have specific instructions to cut rail lines that led into Dublin, but after that, what were they supposed to do? If you look at what was supposed to happen on the western seaboard, a landing of German weapons that would then be funneled up the west coast, they would be distributed down to Cork, up to Clare, to Limerick and to East Galway. But because it never arrived, well then, any prospect of rebellion in those areas was a moot point. So it's fair to say, the Rising didn't break out because, well, the numbers weren't there to participate in it, the weapons were not there to arm them even if they had turned up, and also the notion of what they were supposed to do had those pieces fallen into place is extremely vague indeed. And there's a final consideration to bear in mind. Liam O'Brien posited the notion that perhaps you would have if weapons had landed, there could be some kind of guerrilla campaign on the west of Ireland, something that would last for a long time and something that in his mind thought might even bring the British to the negotiating table. It's highly unlikely that ever would have happened. Assistance from Germany was solicited because Germany was at war with the United Kingdom, but it goes both ways. The reason, or the manner in which the British suppressed the Rising, is because Britain was at war, and even if you had a more substantial, broadly based and longer lasting rebellion in other parts of the country outside Dublin, it's highly unlikely that in time of war the British authorities would have tolerated that. They would have crushed it just as they crushed what happened in Dublin in April 1916.